Let me know if I can do it.
Well, Ron, I'll put that. I'm interested in that one. Have you got it? Is it?
They weren't ill, were they? They weren't ill. We weren't ill either, thank you. Touch with all that. Yes, same. Lovely. I'll come
Just joking. Good evening and thank you for joining us as we share some memories of Peter. I wrote the eulogy for the funeral. How many of you came to the funeral? Obviously not everybody could. But it's just I thought, well, what am I going to do tonight? Everybody knows Peter and everybody's got their own memories. And I thought, well, perhaps I'll just read the eulogy out and then I can go home. But I thought that was cheating a bit because quite a few of you already heard it. So I won't. Good evening and thank you for joining us. Some of these reflections formed part of the eulogy read at his funeral and were later published in the Society magazine, so forgive me if you've heard some of it before. I suppose that if you were to ask a dozen people, so I don't get to see the photos, that was in 1937, Peter with his mum, by the way. I suppose that if you were to ask a dozen people about their memories of Peter, each would recall something slightly different. Very few truly knew him intimately, and I was certainly not one of them. That privilege perhaps belonged to his sister Jill, his wife Marion, or possibly Ian Godsmark, or Lucy, his beloved step-granddaughter. Although Peter and I shared many interests, I could not say that I was a confidant. I did my best to engage him in conversation, but I was never invited to share his innermost thoughts, unlike those I have already mentioned. I remained very much on the sidelines. At times I even wondered whether Peter saw me simply as a hapless fool, stumbling along while clinging to his coattails. Of course, he would never have said such a thing. He was far too respectful. In truth, I think Peter politely tolerated me, as he did most people. Even so, I hope you'll humour me for a few moments while I share some of my memories of Peter with you. I mentioned in Peter's eulogy that in later life he developed a dislike for driving. I can't remember exactly when he stopped, but I imagine he would have been in his 60s. I don't think he ever planned to take up driving again. However, when Marion became ill and was taken into hospital, Peter decided it was time to get back behind the wheel. Hi, Clive. Take it up with the chairman. Anyway, his car had been safely stored in a rented garage and would probably have needed little more than a service and an MOT to make it roadworthy. He spoke to me about it, and I suggested that perhaps a refresher course with a driving school might be a good idea. He was open to that, but wondered if we might try first a short run in my car just to see how comfortable he was. I know this is making you chuckle here, isn't it? Because you know exactly how I felt. All we needed was somewhere quiet, with little chance of meeting other traffic. So off we went to Rotherbridge Lane, just south of the town, probably that way, with only a handful of properties. It seemed ideal. The lane is about half a mile long, with an easy place to turn around at the bottom. I drove to the turning off the main road and parked up ready for Peter to take over. We swapped sides, he adjusted the seat and the mirror and made himself comfortable. Much of the lane, I'm sure you all know it, that slopes downhill all the way to the river. And in all honesty, it would be possible to release the handbrake and just roll all the way to the bottom. However, in true learner fashion, Peter set off in first gear. Before long, I suggested that it might be a good idea to change up a gear. My suggestion was met with a stony silence, and he remained in first gear all the way to the end of the lane. "Well, that wasn't too bad, was it, Miles?" said Peter, turning to me. Trying not to sound negative, I simply nodded in agreement. I turned the car round and suggested that he might like to try changing gear on the way back up. Off we went again, Peter gripping the gear stick firmly. Once more, we travelled the entire length of the lane in first gear, the engine screaming in distress, Peter still clinging determinedly to the gear stick. Pulling up at the top of the lane, I turned to him and said, "Perhaps that's enough for today. Shall we think about booking that driving lesson?" Of course he never did, and the matter was never raised again. I mentioned in the eulogy that Peter had an enthusiasm for football, particularly watching it on television. He was a lifelong supporter of QPR and had followed them since childhood. But did you know that he once played in golf at Petworth? In later life, it was almost impossible to imagine him doing anything quite so energetic. But there you are. There is a photograph around somewhere, but I couldn't find it. It would have been interesting to show, wouldn't it? Peter in goal. And the mind boggles. Another of Peter's enduring passions was Rupert Bear, hence the jumper. Those who attended the book sales or Petworth Society talks will remember his Rupert Bear pullover, and perhaps also the Rupert Bear curtains that on occasion served as a tablecloth for the more valuable books. They were small, unmistakable details that felt entirely Peter. When it became clear that he would not be returning home, I was glad to be able to rescue both from the house. And whenever a Rupert Bear annual appeared at a sale, it was added to his already impressive collection of well-worn and much-loved copies. Now, whether he ever found the time to read them is something I still rather wonder. Peter disliked music, or at least that is what he told me. Thinking back, I don't ever recall hearing a radio on in the house, although as Marion became confined to the front room, she may have listened to one. However, Peter's one concession to music were marching songs from the Great War, such as "It's a Long Way to Tipperary" and the like. Why he made an exception for them, I don't know, but I suspect it was some connection to his beloved grandfather. The death of Peter's father in 1966 and his mother's struggle to keep their ailing shop afloat forced Peter into a difficult period of transition. For a time he divided his life between university and helping his mother in the shop. It was never a sustainable arrangement, and before long Peter returned permanently to Pound Street and to the life of a shopkeeper that would define so much of who he was. The business, however, could not provide a living for both mother and son, and so in the mid to late 1970s Peter took on a part-time post teaching religious education with a modest sideline in Spanish, French and Latin at an independent girls' school in East Grinstead. At first he travelled to and fro by train and bus, a long and weary journey by any standard, but one that Peter used well, spending those hours quietly reading. It was during his time in East Grinstead that somewhat miraculously he passed his driving test, an achievement that eased his commute and allowed him to begin delivering customers' orders from the shop. Many of you will remember his Morris Minor parked faithfully outside, waiting to be loaded and sent off around the town. Many of my fondest memories of Peter are connected to the monthly book sales we ran for almost 20 years. There were some truly extraordinary and often ridiculous adventures as we travelled far and wide collecting books. On one occasion we were given the entire stock of a retiring bookseller in Portsmouth. We borrowed a very large van and Bill Eldridge supplied a huge quantity of paper potato sacks. Peter, Bill, my wife Maria, my son Carl and I set off on a Sunday morning and cleared the lot. Loading sharp-edged books into paper sacks is never a good idea. Most of them tore open and ended up on the ground, but somehow we managed to get everything home. On another occasion, Chichester Festival Theatre staged a play set in a gentleman's library and offered us the books after the run ended. The set had to be cleared immediately after the final performance. At 9 o'clock, as the audience was leaving, a team of young self-employed New Zealand set clearers descended on the theatre. There were literally thousands of books lying in the set, donated by enthusiastic theatre goers. They stretched on shelves more than 10 feet high. I'm sure you remember this, Ian, don't you? Yes. Keen to finish quickly and get an early night, the New Zealanders put up ladders and began throwing the books down. It was quite a sight, hundreds upon hundreds of books raining down on Peter, Ian and myself, while we tried to pack them into boxes. We eventually left around midnight, only to return early the next morning to collect even more that had been stacked on the pavement outside the theatre and covered with a tarpaulin. It was quite surreal, actually, it really was. It was ridiculous. On yet another occasion, we were offered a house full of thousands of brand new books by a scorned wife. Her husband had been selling books on Amazon, but the marriage had broken down, and she was determined to be rid of them and him. Whether he had any say in the matter, I don't know. But we made countless trips with the van, so many that we were eventually given a key to the house and told to just help ourselves. Peter was incredibly competitive. He would be disappointed if the takings from the book sale fell short of expectations and would try to work out why one month had been less successful than another. Of course, there were so many factors involved that analysis was impossible. We simply moved on to the next month, but there were dozens of other stories I could tell. Most of them were ridiculously bizarre. Despite the hard work and the long hours, I know that Peter got a huge amount of pleasure from the book sales. Shortly after Peter's death, I received messages from former pupils of his, which I thought I might share with you. This was the girls' school in East Grinstead. Dear Miles, on behalf of my year group at Kingsley St Michael's School, I would like to say, remember this is going back to the 70s, so they've got good memories, I'd like to say we were so very sad to read the news that Peter Jerrome had passed away. He was a much-loved teacher, and 50 years on, many of us still retain vivid memories of his classes. He had a lively, somewhat unorthodox teaching style that kept us engaged and led to top-grade results. Another girl said that he was the best teacher she had ever had, and that she achieved an A in religious education because of him. I think his humour was what helped me learn, she wrote. It was wonderful that somebody actually believed in me. One particular example of his style was when we were learning about the trials of Job and how God tested his faith by inflicting a series of calamities upon him, including the loss of his 10 children when his house was blown down in a mighty wind. Mr. Jerrome wailed and cried to convey the misery Job must have felt, inviting us to imagine his despair. We also remember how he described Job scraping his boils with a shard of broken pottery. It's amazing what you remember. When telling us about angels, he would climb onto his chair and wave his arms like wings. Yet another pupil recalled how he would nimbly jump over his chair to reach the other side of the classroom without tripping. Best of all, however, is her memory of the rabbits. Boarders were allowed to keep pets, and there was a long shed full of hutches containing guinea pigs, hamsters and rabbits. Inevitably, some rabbits escaped and some had babies. She recalled that some of us decided that baby bunnies couldn't be left alone, so we kept them in our desks during lessons, lifting the lids to check on them or sitting them on our laps. Mr. Jerrome didn't seem to mind, though he may have suggested returning them to the pet shed before the next lesson. Not every pupil was successful under Peter. Jackie Lawrence wrote, "I think I got a C." He was a very gentle, softly spoken man, from what I can remember, though a bit scruffy. Yes, he was really scruffy, but very kind. I remember he told us if we didn't want to learn, we could just sit at the back and read quietly. But he made it so interesting, I learned a lot. A final recollection of his time at East Grinstead came from a pupil in the last year of the school. I remember Mr. Jerrome. He taught me Latin, well, he tried to. He was a lovely teacher. I seem to remember he would throw the board rubber if you weren't paying attention. We always had fun in his lessons, and he was a wonderful teacher. I remember that one side of his shirt collar was always out, and the other tucked into his jumper. Funny how you remember such things. Peter was truly a man of his time. Were he starting out now, I doubt that he could have achieved a fraction of what he eventually accomplished. Petworth isn't any longer the town of the 1960s, with a static population, many of whom had been born, educated and employed locally. They were more or less a captive audience for him, with an insatiable appetite for the nostalgia that Peter offered them. By accident or design, he had tapped into a rich vein of longing for the good old days, for a time that was slipping away, if not vanishing altogether. I suppose that in just a few years, Peter will simply become a name to be added to the roll call in our town's history. He has followed, to some degree, in the footsteps of Colonel Maud, Major Mount, and of course George Garland, all of whom were known to him. Perhaps a street on the new estate will be named after him, or a blue plaque fixed to the wall of Trowels in Pound Street. Eventually, Peter the man will be forgotten, and just his name will survive, and I doubt that Peter the historian would have it any other way. Forgive me for a second. I was going to read a very, very short piece from the eulogy, but I seem to have mislaid it, so I'll end there. Thank you very much for listening to me. Do you recognise them? No. And he didn't have his Rupert jumper on either.
I'm going to stand this side because we can't research it in some ways. And I wanted to really talk to you about some of the things that he wrote. It's pretty obvious, actually. I shouldn't be doing this presentation. It's not for me to do. He should be. But he refused. And I think it was probably a little bit emotional for him. This is a rare photograph, actually. He hasn't got his bandana on. And in fact, Lord Egmont did say to me, would I do the lecture in a bandana? I might get away with it. But I'm nowhere near as hirsute as Jonathan is. But he's going to write a piece in the next magazine during March about his relationship with Peter. I think that will be good. So, where did it all start? Where did it start? It started at the Angel Hotel. So many things do start there. "50 years ago. The first one. Have you all read it? I think it's quite hard going, actually. I really do. Peter's not been able to influence his style, because his style starts going into many of the books that he was co-authoring and authoring afterwards. But you know, it's there. It's an important one to have. He said it was unknown, but in fact, in his autobiography, he names him as John Osborne Greenfield. Miles, that was the publican at the Angel, wasn't it?
It was, but it was never posted through, but yes, it was suspected.
So was that another one of Peter's exaggerations, do you think?
Yes. he never positively, I think, suggested.
I did read it many years ago, actually, and thought, oh, very interesting, but colourful characters from Petworth, and Petworth doesn't have these colourful characters any longer, do they, Miles? But 150 years ago, and later enlarged. So that was the first one. Then this one. That was the second one. And this one again is full of text. The 9th Earl of Northumberland, I'm sure none of his relatives are here today. It reads a bit like Dickens, doesn't it? With Jardine and Jardine at the Court of Chancery. But it's a good book, and it's an interesting book. And it does enlighten us on how things were 400 years ago. But then, a different direction. Less text, more images. And this was the third one that they put together, mainly with George Garland's photographs. And I think that's the attraction with so many of these books, when you see pictures of Petworth as it was once upon a time. They're all for sale. Does anyone recognise her? It's Florence Rapley. And we have actually got copies of the book, but they're not covered. And we got a quote to get them covered to actually sell, and it was something like £50 per book. We weren't quite sure that people would be willing to pay that kind of money for this book. It's of interest to me because we used to live opposite Rapley's, and I knew Jim Rapley really well. I don't think he ever mentioned his famous mum. But yes, that's who that is. This one is here. It's the fair. What are we going to do about the fair? What are we going to do about it? And will it continue in its present, or its old form, in its present form or not? It's a difficult one. I don't know this one. We haven't got this one, have we, Ron? No. No. These are my personal favourites, actually. I really like them because, and they're here. This one here, we've got plenty of. This one here is much rarer, and we're very low on copies of this. But I like them because they do relate the history of Petworth, and I think they give a vivid account of Petworth. And I know the amount of research that must have gone into this. And in fact, interestingly enough, I did a load of research myself. I did 2 dissertations in my career. One of them in the 80s, and I can remember going down to St Richard's Hospital, and there was this row and row and row of books that were the authors that I might want to read, and then an even bigger row was the papers that they'd written. And my guess is that Peter must have been doing this, going down to the record offices, looking at the letting field, the state papers, the house papers, and all this kind of stuff. A lot of research went into it. The second time I did some research, interesting enough, was about 10 years ago. And I used something called Google Scholar. And Google Scholar was fabulous, because Google Scholar told me everywhere what the relevant papers were and where I could find them, invariably where I could buy them. But Google Scholar made things so much easier than the slow reading of these things. So what's about modern? Will Peter take to modernity in research, do you think? I mean, when I say AI, Janet, I'm not talking about that kind of AI. Right? This is definitely artificial intelligence. So I wrote into GPT Peter Jerrome as an author. This one's interesting. People are actually looking for. I had somebody phone me up the other day and said, "Have we got any copies of this?" I didn't know anything about the Locksmith dependents, but I'm sure quite a few people here do know about them. But an interesting book, picked up by AI. So Sweet as the Fox, that's the Florence Raftery book. Why that was mentioned, I don't know. And his autobiography, most of the time, Petworth. Interesting read. The scary thing is that that's at 1.23 seconds. Now, how would Peter have dealt with that for a second? Just on tap, you get that information. It's kind of worrying. But having read Peter's book, I just begin to appreciate what a great wordsmith he was. I mean, some of the stuff he wrote, I thought, I would never have written that. You know, and I write a lot, but I would never have done that. I just thought, fantastic. Peter's a writer. He headed one of his, one of these books, a chapter on who was Haile Selassie. And this is what he wrote. That is quite interesting. That's introspective. It makes you read the whole article twice. I just thought, yes, Peter, that's great. Peter again. I've never quite viewed Market Square like that, but now I do. Now I go down and I look at Market Square and think, has he got a mood on today? Has the farmer's market got a mood on today? What's going on here? Is it mercurial? Peter again, but with humour. He's talking about the book sale here, and he picks up a book. And try a question, a quiz book. Who can remember who Columbo was? Yeah, I think so. Yeah. What was the make of Columbo's car? And he said, I haven't the faintest. He hasn't the faintest. But then he said this. Where will it end? And you look at TV these days and they're full of quiz programs. It seems to be the most popular thing around. And we all laugh because the people on them are so bad at the questions. They really are not terribly good. So, what's the answer? Columbo's car. Tricky word. Oops, wrong button. Come back, Columbo's car. I asked Jonathan, I knew that Peter had written quite a bit of poetry, and I actually knew that Jonathan appreciated it, and he said, this is a lovely poem. Now, I had to look up what immersing meant. But I'm sure you all know that, don't you? It's the law term. Is that right, Ian?
Never heard it.
Really? What kind of lawyer are you? It means a fine or something, or some kind of penalty, if I looked it up. But I still think it's a lovely poem. It really is. The latest and last. 33 in all. Rather smugly, I've got one. I've got one number 33. That's going to be worth a fortune in the future, I'll tell you that now. You'll go onto Amazon Books and you'll have to pay £500 for that. I'm going to hand over to Lord Egmont now, who's going to talk about Peter the Historian.
It was so good to hear these two talks from Miles and from Michael. It really makes one understand that there were several Peter Jerromes. There were so many aspects of this remarkable man. There was Peter, the biblical scholar, the linguist who could read Spanish, French, Hebrew, Syriac, Aramaic, ancient Greek, Latin and Russian. There was Peter, the leader of our society. There was Peter the greengrocer, the tradesman. There was Peter the poet, the romantic. There was Peter the teacher. There was Peter the family man, the delightful friend. Indeed, he was a polymath. But I'm only going to speak about a small part of Peter's achievement as a historian, his work as a historian. His parents, of course, were both readers, his father particularly having, as Peter writes, a definite feel for words, an enthusiasm for Shakespeare, Dickens and Mark Twain, as well as Karl Marx, which took him into the Communist Party in the 1940s. Mr. Jerrome's politics gave him what one might describe as an enduring scepticism about the Leconfield estate and about my family. This may have been the reason that during my childhood we shopped at Hazelman's rather than Jerome. I see you're here, Janet, this evening. You've grown rich on my family. Anyway. Peter's mother, however, was more tolerant of the town and its hierarchy, having known it from childhood. Her father, Mr. Allison, had been my great-uncle Charles Leconfield's water surveyor and bailiff. I began to know Peter well after my father died in 1972, and I had to come back to Petworth. Then, of course, he was exceptionally busy, not only transforming the Petworth Society from a single-issue pressure group that wanted to put the road through the park into a serious forum, much more serious, for local history and for teaching. And in addition to all this, He was teaching himself and he was running the family business. He found time, however, as we've heard, to write a book. A first-class piece of research into a 16th century dispute between the Earl of Northumberland, an ancestor of mine, and his tenants. The tenants were led by a man called William James, whose combination of courage and weakness, and this comes out very clearly in the book, could come from a novel by Joseph Conrad. I'm thinking particularly of Lord Jim, of course. Published in 1979 as Cloak, Bag and Common Purse, it uncovered the complications, and how complicated they were, of medieval copyhold rights, chancery lawsuits and manorial courts, which had to be disentangled from a variety of sources. Cloak, Bag and Common Purse, a very interesting and a first-class piece of research, was followed by a series of books about Petworth and its surroundings. Peter showed himself to be a dogged and skillful researcher among wills, court records, inventories, ancient invoices, vestry books, details of enclosures and account ledgers. His longest work, as Michael was saying, is a 2-volume history of the town, surely the most complete account of Petworth's past. The first volume reaches 1660, and the second takes the story up to the present day. The book stretches from the vast and mysterious forest that covered most of primeval Sussex. It goes through the Roman time, the Romans at Duncton, and the origin of the Saxon name of Petworth, which derives from Piotr's enclosure in the wood. Peter shows how the arrival of the Normans and the Percys began that enduring sense of Petworth as a feudal domain. In 1904, the writer E.V. Lucas could still think that the inescapable lord is as present in the very air of the streets as is the presage of a thunderstorm. I wish that were true today. As in Cloak, Bag and Common Purse, the reach of these volumes is daunting. Peter uses the vast collection of manorial documents in the Petworth House Archives, which begins in 1350, and delves deep into the landscape and its people. He's determined not to let the story become too dominated or eclipsed by the big house and the estate that has passed, after all, in unbroken descent from the Percy family to the Seymours and then to the Wyndhams. Peter knew, however, that there is much more to the town than its landlords. Isn't a vast palace like Petworth and the land around it made as much by those who have worked and lived there, the carpenters, craftsmen, bricklayers, farm workers, shepherds, traders, the preachers and the rectors, as by its owners? Peter takes this further in his editing of How Sweet the Phlox Is, the journal of Florence Rapley, who lived at Heath End in the early 1900s, and the book by Evelyn Pentecost called A Shepherd's Daughter. As he comes nearer the present, and I speak as somebody who's written history himself, we see the skill of Peter's interviewing techniques. When he began to write about Petworth, there were still those around who remembered life before the First World War, and plenty who had memories of the 1920s and 1930s and the Second War years. Peter was very adept at coaxing lively memories from these, not taking a tape recorder to the session, making only a very few notes. The results brought out, I think, character and atmosphere, as well as the actual words of the conversation. Inevitably, of course, the landowners feature, from the Earls of Northumberland to the Dukes of Somerset, the Earls of Egremont and the Leconfields, and me. But there's a wonderful, often bizarre cast of others. We meet the land agents, William Tyler, who apparently enjoyed taking young men's trousers down. I don't think anybody who works for the firm of Savills engages in that. To Mr. Watson and Mr. Brido, who organised the schemes of assisted emigration to Canada and Australia. We meet the tradespeople and the rectors and the farmers and the publicans and the labourers, many of whom have names one sees in Pepworth today. The crowd grows even larger in numbers in Peter's books about Ebernoe and the Pepworth Fair. The book on Ebernoe must have been particularly hard to research, as there are no papers for the Peachy family, who were lords of the manor there from the 17th century until 1910. Peter includes gamekeepers and clergymen and iron workers and witches and admirals and cricketers and fox hunters and owners of carousels and of roundabouts and members of obscure evangelical sects such as the Coaklers or Dependents. The story reaches into the courts of medieval Europe through Ebernoe's reputation as a source for dwarfs. He includes what I think is very useful advice on how to breed a satisfactory dwarf. Peter's later book on the streets of Pepworth, Tread Lightly Here, unveils a massive information about names and identities of shops and tradesmen and dates and the initial purpose of prominent buildings. Again, as in his other works, we're reminded of what has gone. Those huge edifices, such as the vast prison off Grove Street, designed by the architect James Wyatt and demolished in 1881, or the former workhouse at the end of North Street that came down in the 1960s. I have childhood memories of the workhouse, which then had a petrol station and garage in front of it. Peter shows brilliantly that change can be gradual or sometimes shockingly fast. I find his account of 20th century Pepworth very moving, when two wars transformed the town from a feudal world into what it is today, with the Leconfield estate fading as an influence and an employer. The Second World War brought the tragedy of the bombing of the boys' school. This and the taking down of the church spire in the late 1940s left a sense, which Peter described so well, of a community bereft and confused. It's often a heroic existence that Peter describes. The farmers struggling on few acres, the labourers badly used and housed, the widows left stranded without homes. Sometimes a particular story prompts astonishment and pity, such as that of Dick, who lived in a shed on an allotment during the 1930s because he had no job and no money. In Peter's books, the gentry flash by, often on horses, as they go about their business, perhaps to hunt the fox, or go out for a ride, or drive in a carriage, or trap, or later motor car, to shoot, or to serve as magistrates, or to attend the assizes, or call on each other, as in the novels of Jane Austen or Trollope. Peter untangles the story of Pepworth's different modes of worship, from the Congregational Church, built in the 1890s, to the Roman Catholic Church of 1896, and the Ebenezer Chapel, once an evangelical centre and now a private house. The most prominent of these is the Anglican Church of St. Mary's, where Eton College was patron of the living until the Duke of Somerset took it over in the 1690s. We hear of various rectors and their conduct and characters, of John Quicksby's dispute in 1447 over the grazing rights for his pigs. Then those 17th century holders of the benefice, such as Richard Montague or the Bishop of Chichester, who were also rectors of Pepworth, Brown Dupper and Henry King, whose exequy to his dead wife is one of the most beautiful poems of grief and longing in the English language. The austere Puritan Francis Cheynell is appointed after Parliament removes the royalist and poet Henry King. Some 300 years later, in 1943, Mr. Godwin helps to search among the devastation of the bombed school for the living and the dead. Peter's memory, as does mine, goes back to Mr. York, a courteous and rather remote figure, and to Mr. York's curate, Mr. Wilmer, who was more approachable as he went about the tower on a sputtering moped. I once asked Peter if he, as a scholar of the Bible, had been friends with various rectors. His answer, given with a modest smile, was, "Perhaps they avoid me, because they think I know more about it all than they." One of Peter's closest friendships, as Michael said, was with George Garland, the photographer and journalist who came to Pepper's to work soon after the First World War. Garland had accumulated an archive of his predecessor, Walter Keyvis, who had retired in 1908. This made a long and remarkable photographic record of the town and the villages and the country nearby. From this came the series of books beautifully produced by Jonathan Newdick's Windows Press that evoke a lost rural world. Until his death in 1978, George Garland guided and stimulated Peter. The past probably was never as good as it can seem in these photographs, whose charm and serenity prompt ideas of a lost golden age. The Garland books show the extraordinarily productive partnership between Peter and Jonathan that started in the 1970s. Their first book together was, as Michael said, The Tales of Old Petworth, a series of stories about the early 19th century Petworth, compiled by John Osborne Greenfield, once the landlord of the Angel Inn. Jonathan describes how Greenfield's manuscript was found by George Garland in the pub's bar, where it was being used as a beer mat. The Windows Press series, a remarkable series, ends with Peter's last book on the Petworth Society's book sales, called A Sardonic Crow and Other Observations. Earlier titles such as Peter Dead Drunk and Those That Are Never Seen Below Stairs at Petworth House again show Peter's interviewing skills, assisted sometimes by Diana Owen and by my wife Caroline. He discovered several people who'd come to Petworth during the war as part of the evacuation of children from London and the cities. To speak of Peter as a historian is, as I said at the start, to show only a small part of him. Other books of his, also published by the Windows Press, reveal his appreciation of literature and breadth of curiosity, as in 11 Sussex books and 8 books, a choice of 8 favourites that range from French to Spanish, the Bible and America. Peter also wrote about his years in the shop, showing perhaps that he was not a natural tradesman. Then, Sir Deadman Smiles and Nostalgia, collections of articles that he wrote for the Petworth Society magazine, and his own poems in a bag with holes. Petworth's knowledge of history, Peter's knowledge of history can be seen in the Petworth Cottage Museum, which he helped to create. He and others, particularly the late Mrs. Walters, made this High Street cottage, formerly owned by the Leconfield estate, into an example of Edwardian working class life. The most striking feature of the display is a model of a beautiful seated woman working at her sewing. Although this is meant to be Mrs. Cummings, a seamstress who lived there in the early 1900s, Peter and I agreed that it looks remarkably like my late mother. So we have our many memories of Peter. We have the Petworth Society and its magazine, which he made into a record of our town's history and what is happening here today. Then we have his books, those books that he wrote. These are why we speak wrongly of him in the past tense for his books are alive. How fortunate we were to have had Peter Jerrome as our friend and guide. We are fortunate also that through his works and his books he is with us still.
Shall we come down? Okay. Alice? Any questions for the speakers?
Right. I think one of the things that's been missed was Peter the gardener. He went to the cottage museum. You find him planting, clearing, and talking about them with what seemed to me a very good knowledge of the cottage garden. Somebody who didn't seem to practice it elsewhere. It was always a joy to meet him there when one was stewarding there.
Well, he's certainly missed in that role because I've taken that role on. And maybe I think you designed it originally, didn't
And
you?
I originally put plant in that Mr. Cumming might know. Yes, originally. I don't know what it's like now. But I'm very
Dreadful. Absolutely dreadful. And if I've got anything to do with it, it's going to be dreadful.
There's definitely an Eglinton Road by the Privy. Hope so. Because there always used to be.
I think that's still there actually.
Roads
In
at
fact,
Eglinton area.
it's stopping people entering the Privy. It's like ridiculous.
It's also got a delicious smell on a rainy day. That's the point. About the Privy.
Thank you.
But, yeah.
Andrew?
Just to mention, I gather that Peter has associations with Essex, particularly Gideon Park, and by pure coincidence, historically speaking, Humphrey Repton had his design workshop there, at Hare Street near Rockford, and as I said, I know that Peter also would have known about the agricultural depression in Essex. And of course, a lot of his background information could have been transferred to Petworth. That's what I'm trying to say. But by coincidence, a master at the school where my father taught came from Gideon Park and was multilingual. So there we are. I don't know whether Peter
Well, certainly
Very powerful,
he mentions that in his autobiography. We were talking about this earlier, Gideon Park. So I mean, but I don't think that. Ron, are there many copies of this around? Or Miles, I think you said there are a few.
When he died, there was about 20 copies in the house, which most of them I've got.
Of course, Repton was, working at Upmark. And he was a landscape designer. He didn't actually do what Larsop Capability did a few years earlier, but he was very much a link with Gideon Park and this area.
I think that's wishful thinking. Peter's father was a salesman for the Hoover Company. Those who know that part of London, there was a huge Hoover factory there, and he was very successful in that. But I think that the family had any connections to anything remaining in the area.
But you do spoil the
Well,
dreams.
Gideon Park was actually an estate, specially created in the 20s and 30s. And they pulled down Gideon Hall to make it in the park. But I just thought I'd mention that link with Repton, an architectural historian, because that's what he was, Peter.
Yes.
Yes, I have a question for Lord Egremont. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
It's difficult without a microphone, isn't it? Lord Egremont, I was just wondering whether in your many discussions with Peter, you ever sat down over a beer or a glass of wine and discussed his vision for the future of Petworth?
Yes, well, we did talk about it. He was rather pessimistic about the way that Petworth had changed, but I think that happens to all people as they get older. They think that the world was better in the old days. I think he did regret the fact that his father became a communist. I do remember that.
no reason for you to buy the mail anymore, is there? And he continued to buy it, mainly to irritate me.
Okay, well, thank you all for coming. This event is something that we hope will become an annual event. And so let's hope this takes it forward, and Pete's memory is always with us. Thank you. And the bastard of yeah.